In this lesson, we're going to consider what happens to whole industries over time as they expand and as they fall, called the rise and fall of industries. Not just individual firms in the industry, but all the firms in the industry. The concept we want to stress as we do this is the long run versus the short run in this industry. The long run for an industry is a situation where firms have either completely entered or exited the industry, and it's settled down to kind of a long run equilibrium. In the short run for an industry, it's a situation where firms haven't either entered yet or exited yet. It's kind of a situation waiting for change. So it's a short run is where you haven't had this entry or exit, and the long run is where you have had the entry and exit. You want to contrast this concept of long run and short run with the concept of long run and short run for a single firm. Recall that for a single firm, the long run is where it can adjust all its inputs of production, not just labor, but also capital. And the short run is where it can only adjust some of its inputs, labor, for example, but not capital. So the words long run and short run are being used for two different concepts. One is we're considering a firm, and the other we're considering the whole industry. Of course, in reality, both of these could be happening at the same time, but to explain it, we want to focus on one and the other. We focused on long run and short run of the firm before. Now we're going to consider long run and short run for the industry. When you think about the long run and short run for the industry, we want to introduce a model. This model has a name. It's the long run competitive equilibrium model. It's actually a lot of fun to work with. It's dynamic. You can see what's happening over time. And it has only 3 ingredients, and 2 we've even seen before. So in a sense, there's only one new ingredient to explain how this dynamic model works over time. First ingredient is the cost curves, which we've seen. So we're going to assume that each firm in this industry, we'll call it the typical firm, has marginal costs, average total costs, and average variable costs, and we can represent that in the graph which we've seen before with quantity on the horizontal axis and dollars on the vertical axis, and you can see marginal cost cutting through average total costs at the bottom, a typical kind of curve. Actually, we're not going to even need the average variable cost curve for this picture, so we can just get rid of that one and look at a picture with just marginal cost and average total cost. That's all we'll need. And we've seen it before. It's nothing new. Next thing we're going to look at is this concept of a firm being competitive in the industry and where the market demand curve slopes down. Okay, so you want to consider 2 things. On the left, you can see a diagram which represents production of a single firm, a typical firm in the industry. On the vertical axis, we have the price of that firm. Again, horizontal axis, quantity produced at the single firm. Vertical axis, the price that typical firm faces in this competitive market. On the right, we see the total market in which this typical firm operates, along with many other typical firms. The demand for the product for this firm and the other firms together is called the market demand curve. That's all the people in the market, all the people that are buying bicycles or whatever this firm produces. And it, of course, is downward sloping, representing the fact that when the price increases, the quantity demanded declines. Now remember, on the left, a single firm production is on the horizontal axis. On the right, the total market. When a single firm looks out at the market, if it's a competitive market, recall that firm looks at that price and takes it as a given. So effectively, the demand curve from the perspective of a typical firm is perfectly flat. Basically, takes that price as given. We've explained that that's the nature of a competitive market. Seems strange sometimes because you imagine a firm setting the price, but the reality of that competition is it really can't affect that price very much. It takes it as a given. But that doesn't mean that the total market as a whole doesn't change when the price changes. And if all the firms are facing and charging a higher price, the quantity demanded goes down. So we want to use these 2 curves together to explain what happens over time in a competitive market with many typical firms. So I want to draw a little diagram to illustrate this. The diagram is going to depend on this 3rd assumption, which is free entry and exit, the 3rd component of this model. And this is key. It's a little different, but it's very fundamental to competition. We're going to assume that firms can enter the industry or exit the industry. They can get out if they don't want to be in that industry, don't want to produce bicycles anymore, or they can come in if they look like it's a good business to be in the bicycle production business. But we're also going to assume that they don't do this randomly. They do this depending on what the profits prospects are. And in particular, if they're in the industry, then firms exit the industry if profits are negative, if they're getting losses. Makes sense. And if firms will also enter the industry if their profits are positive, if they see there's gains to be made. So this entry and exit decision is not random. It's based on these profit considerations. And remember, when we talk about profits, when economists talk about profits, we mean economic profits. And when we compute economic profits, we've considered opportunity costs as part of total costs. And so the equilibrium of this is going to be zero economic profits. Accounting profits will be positive because when we take out opportunity costs, we get zero economic profits. So the concept here will be we have this dynamic, firms entering when profits are expected to be positive, and they're leaving when profits are expected to be negative. So let's now go to town and make this little three-part model work. I need to have a diagram to do this, and so let me draw the diagram so you can see what's going on. And I want to have this typical firm and the market together. So on the left-hand side of the diagram, we'll draw a picture for the typical firm, and on the right-hand side, we'll draw a picture for the market. So this is typical firm over here, and this is the market over here. On both graphs, and this is important, we're going to put the price. And the price is the same in both diagrams. It represents the price of bicycles in the market. Now, the typical firm in this market is going to have an average total cost curve and a marginal cost curve. So let's draw that. There's the marginal cost curve, and there's the average total cost curve going through the bottom point, as it should. And we know that this typical firm will produce and where the price is equal to marginal cost. But we also want to set up the diagram so that there's zero profit for this firm to get started. Okay, so all I want to do is try carefully to draw my price line that firm faces so that it intersects the marginal cost curve just at the bottom point of average total cost. So that's going to be that flat line. That's the price this typical firm sees in the market. And it's drawn at just the point, again, at the bottom of average total cost where marginal cost intersects. This is the position that a competitive firm would operate in if that was the price it faced. It would face that price, set marginal cost equal to the price. That would determine the amount it would produce. And at this point, it just happens to be at low point in average total cost curve. Now, this is one firm in the market. There's a lot of these typical firms in the market. And there's some of those typical firms is going to generate a supply curve in the market. And there's also going to be a demand curve in the market. So let's draw that over on the right. There's the demand curve. It should be downward sloping because, for example, when the price is high, quantity of bicycles demanded will be down. But we want to make sure that the price in this market, let's draw it right there because I know where it's got to be, it's got to be about the same point, not about, exactly the same point as the price on the left. So that means that the supply curve has to go through right there. Okay, and that's the market equilibrium, as you know, the intersection of supply and demand. And we've drawn it so the intersection occurs just at that price that the typical firm is facing. Okay, so this would be what economists would call the long-run competitive equilibrium. Economic profits are zero because average total cost is equal to the price. There's no incentive for firms to enter the industry or exit the industry, with economic profits being zero. Again, if economic profits were positive, firms would come in. If economic profits were negative, firms would leave. This is kind of the equilibrium. And we've drawn it, of course, just to emphasize one more time, where the supply, which is the sum of the marginal costs for all the firms in the industry, is drawn where it intersects the demand curve at just that same point. So that's how it works. And you can make this look a little fancier with colored lines, but the picture that I drew is pretty much the same. Left-hand side, typical firm, right-hand side, market. Left-hand side has the horizontal axis, the firm's quantity. Right-hand side, the total market quantity. Left-hand side, the firm takes that price as given, but that price has to equal the level of a price where the supply curve and the demand curve intersect on the right-hand side of the picture. That's the market price. And then, of course, we've set this up so that that price intersects the marginal cost curve at the low point on the average total cost curve. This is the equilibrium. Now, to make this model work over time, to see what happens when there's something in the market, we want to sort of disturb this picture. We want to change something and see what happens in the market. So what we're going to do first is just ask the question, what happens in this market if there's an increase in demand, say an increase in the demand for bicycles in the market? So to do that, we're first going to look at the short-run effects. Then we're going to look what happens over time as firms enter and exit. That's a big part of the dynamics here. And then we're going to finally check to see if we've got a new long-run equilibrium and what that long-run equilibrium actually looks like. So let's put the graphs up here. First of all, to start with, we're going to call this see what happens first in the short run. So again, the pictures are drawn just where there's this sense of balance on the left and on the right, supply curve intersecting demand curve at a price that intersects marginal cost on the left at the bottom point of average total cost. Now, let's see what happens. Suppose there's an increase in demand. So demand increases. There it is. The demand curve is shifted. We now get a new equilibrium at a higher price, as the arrow indicates. And we can draw across the diagram that new higher price. So again, all we've done is say, oh, demand curve shifts out. We know from our theory of market demand and supply that's going to cause the price to rise at the new intersection of supply and demand. And now we can take that over to the left-hand side of the diagram, and we see that there's a higher price. Now, the typical firm in this industry is going to observe this higher price. And what's it going to do? It's going to say, well, I want to adjust my production so that the marginal cost equals this new price. And so we can represent that in the diagram. By showing the new intersection of the price and the marginal cost, which is right at this point here in the diagram. And then we can drop down to show that that is the new amount of production. But no, with this higher price is going to be greater than average total cost. So that means revenue, price times quantity, is going to be greater than total costs, average total cost times quantity. And so in the green area that's shaded in, that's profits now. So profits have become positive because the firm is getting a higher price. It's also increased its production. And now, if you look at this picture, it's now going to give some incentive for firms to come in the industry. Firms are going to be out there saying, prospective firms out there saying, hey, maybe I should go into this industry now because there's some profits to be made. And so now that entry into the industry is what's going to drive this. And to do this, we want to see what the new equilibrium will look like. And so to do that, let's go to the picture that shows what happens a little over time. We're going to call this the long run. We're going to go from the short run to the long run over time. So over the longer run, firms will have observed that there was profits to be made. And so as a result, more firms are going to come into the industry. And we represent that by a shift in the supply curve. Remember, supply curve is the summing up of all those individual supply curves or marginal cost curves. So as the number increases, the supply curve shifts out to the right. How far will it shift out to the right? Well, if we want to get to a new long-run equilibrium, it's got to shift out to the right to the point where the price is equal to the old price, because that's the only place where the average total cost curve will be at a bottom point and where prices therefore equal average total costs, and profits will again be zero. So the new equilibrium represents a situation where price equals average total cost, just like the old equilibrium. The only difference now is that there's more produced in the market. You can see that the amount produced is larger over on the right of the picture. We've gone over this direction, more being produced. And that's because not only has the demand curve shifted, which has induced more firms to come into the business, but the supply curve has shifted because more firms are coming into the business. So more is being produced by more firms. Each firm is back to a situation with zero economic profits, and that's the story of going from the short run to the long run. Now, this story has an interesting implication. I call it another nice feature of competitive markets. And that is that since profits are zero in the long run equilibrium, price is equal average total costs. And if price is equal average total cost, that means in the long run industry equilibrium, average total cost curve is at a minimum. All those pictures in the equilibrium had the average total cost curve at the bottom. So we've kind of minimized costs because of this competitive force of firms entering and exiting the industry. Didn't have that before we had exit and entry, but exit and entry provided this extra force, extra competitive pressure that brings firms into the industry and drives profits back to zero if profits tend to exist. So in other words, cost per unit is as low as you can go. Now this concept of what happens over the long term for an industry gives rise to another kind of economies of scale. We described economies of scale for a single firm as it grows in size and average total cost goes down. But when a whole industry expands, the firm's cost may shift down, even though the scale at each firm doesn't necessarily expand. Why might this occur? Well, a larger industry may make it cheaper to produce because other firms may be around to help service the industry. If in a particular area, the number of firms producing software might be expanding, and that may give incentive for some particular experts in a type of programming to come in to service those software producers. So it reduces costs for that reason. You can illustrate this in a diagram, very similar to what we just did before with both the demand curve and the supply curve shifting, but with an interesting subtle difference. It shows the demand curves shifting out. Okay, that could have been because there's an increase in demand for the product, say bicycles. And it also shows the supply curve shifting out as more firms enter the industry. We've seen that before in the first example. But in this case, it's different because the supply curves are shifting out by more than the demand curves. So that little shift there is that amount. That little shift there is larger. It's a larger amount. So it's shifting out by more. And the reason it's shifting out by more is not only are there more firms entering the industry, which shifts it out, but the costs at each firm are declining. Marginal costs at each firm are declining, so that makes the supply curve shift even further. And with it shifting further, it means that the new equilibrium, say when you go to S1 to S2, supply curve 1 to supply curve 2, corresponding the intersection with demand curve 1, demand curve 2, the price actually goes down. And then if you even get a larger market, the farm goes down in that direction too. So you can see there's a scale in the sense the industry getting bigger, the market getting bigger, and that scale reduces costs and as a result reduces price in the market. So kind of interestingly, economies of scale for a market, they're called external economies of scale because it's not because the firm itself is increasing, that would be internal, it's external economies of scale. And it generates another important feature of markets that as the size of the market expands, frequently there's ways that the cost and therefore the price decline, and that's an example of external economies of scale. You can imagine you could have external diseconomies of scale. That might occur because of, say, scarce resources as the industry gets larger. There's not enough water, not enough facilities, for example, and costs could actually increase. So in principle, one can have external diseconomies of scale too. But whether they're external economies or external diseconomies, they occur as the whole industry increases in size. And we can illustrate, and we did illustrate how that can be described with a simple model which includes a regular description of how firms behave with their marginal costs and average total cost curve, a picture of what the market looks like from a particular firm versus the total market, and then this idea of entry and exit forcing economic profits to zero. So that's the story of long-run competitive equilibrium. Thank you.